we are going to record today because we have lots of requests from people who cannot be here at this exact hour, but are really interested to hear from the team at Next City. As folks are joining us, if you could put in the chat your name, where you work or where you freelance, and what's your favorite mode of transportation? Oh, Kelly, I love riding ferries too. I recently found out, I guess I should have known this, that Washington State has, I guess, the largest ferry system in the US.
Oh, yeah, not surprising.
Yeah. I just always, I don't know, it's always been here. Didn't think about it much.
Yeah.
Love the ferries.
Gondola. Have you ever been on a gondola, Rachel?
Yeah, there's a gondola in Portugal.
Wow, nice.
This gondola to get from one side of the city to the other.
Nice.
And they're trying to build one in DC, and every time it comes up, people say, ha 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 ha, that's never going to get built. And then like 6 months later, they're like, here's another study that says it'll get built. And
what about it on the Potomac?
To cross, from Georgetown into Arlington. Because there's no metro in Georgetown.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's very funny that like gondola is a practical option.
I know. I actually I don't hate it because like think of all the tourists who are staying in hotels in Arlington who would love to be able to go to Georgetown on public transportation.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
I don't know. It's pretty funny.
Welcome
to Gondola. I want to meet you.
Welcome to everyone who is joining us now. We are talking about favorite modes of transportation. If you could add in the chat your name, where you work or where you freelance, and your favorite mode of transportation. Hi, Martha. Nice to see you. I see you in the chat. We're going to give folks just a couple of minutes to join, and then we will get started. So right now in the chat, we are adding we've got people coming in. Your name, where you work, where you freelance, and your favorite mode of transportation.
Unfortunately, your car, Martha, if it's not your favorite.
Yeah. Not most frequently used mode of transportation.
Yeah, your favorite.
Horse.
Nice. I love that. I lived for many years in Hoboken, New Jersey, and it was frustrating to me that the ferry was so cost prohibitive as a mode of commuting.
Kelly, I thought you were going to say something about horses. I'm sorry.
No, sorry. I didn't ever. I took horseback riding lessons as a kid, but did not commute by horse.
Hi, Michael. Hi, Bonnie. Hadley. If folks are joining us, we're adding into the chat name, where you work or where you freelance for primarily, or the outlets you freelance for. Love folks sharing too where you're based, and we're curious about your favorite mode of transportation. You're joined today by folks who think about cities a lot, think about how cities can be better. Transportation is a big part of life anywhere. Transportation also, I think, an undercovered issue in rural communities as well. Mm-hmm. Melissa.
Wow, exclusively by horseback.
The combustion engine hasn't made it out there yet.
We are recording today, so if you know folks who were not able to join us, I'll be posting this session in a shareable YouTube link later. So I'll send it out and I can send it to your colleagues. Feel free to email me. I'm going to put my info here. I am Sarah Gustavus Lim. I am SJN's Economic Mobility Manager. I work with newsrooms and journalists covering responses to poverty and what's working across the US, so in both urban and rural communities. And if you want to talk more about what that means and your work around covering economic mobility, I'm also happy to chat with you. I'm going to put my email in the chat here right now. And I am here to just help us kick off this amazing conversation with Next City. If you saw our invite, they're a prolific producer, publisher of great solutions reporting. I share their stories all the time. I find that, often they are very relevant to other newsrooms that I'm working with and great examples that I just love to send people by email. So I am also, I'm really excited to learn today about how they approach their work, how they work with freelancers, what solutions journalism means for their organization and for their mission. So now I'm going to turn it over to Kelly.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Sarah, and thanks for joining us, everyone. I'm Kelly Regan. I'm the editorial director for Next City, and I've been with Next City for about 3.5 years now, and I've spent more than 2 decades in journalism and publishing, and solutions journalism is something I feel really passionately about, and very inspired at the work that we do at Next City. And I'm going to tell you a little more about who we are in case you're not familiar with us and what we do. But first, I want to hand it off to Rachel so she can introduce herself as well.
Oh, okay, sure. Hi, I'm Rachel Kaufman. Thanks again, Sarah, for having us. I'm the senior editor at Next City. I've been with Next City officially for about 2.5 years and freelanced for Next City before that. So I guess you could say I was a Next City super fan before coming on board. The term solutions journalism was new to me when I came to Next City, but as I think about it, I think that sort of the ideas of solutions journalism have sort of been infused into my journalistic practice pretty much my whole career. Before coming to Next City, I was a science journalist. And while a lot of science journalism is talking about like new things that have been discovered, things they might do, there's also a lot of really important weight placed on evidence of impact and sort of looking back to see how we can look forward. So even though the terminology was new to me when I came to Next City, it's definitely something that I feel very passionately about as well.
All right, so Sarah, I think I just had wanted to give a brief overview of Next City and who we are. We started in 2003, so we're in our 18th year right now, and founded as a print magazine. And what's really interesting about Next City is that it was started at a time before solutions journalism was a thing, but the 3 founders, who were not journalists, really got together and decided that they wanted to start a magazine that talked about cities as the source of solutions and not the source of problems. There was a lot of talk about the death of cities at that point, and people, there had been this white flight, and it was really before cities started to really come back as thriving places to live, or that were perceived as thriving places to live. And I think their point was, this isn't, cities aren't what they're being painted as. They're actually these really exciting incubators for new ideas, and people are taking charge of the way that they want to live in cities. And so they wanted a magazine that would speak to that. So we are a nonprofit news organization. We are now exclusively online, although the pictures here are of some special issues that we do at the end of every year to highlight the best solutions of the year that we have published. But we are an organization that we have a mission to unleash the transformative power of solutions journalism. So our mission statement is really, we want to use solutions journalism to give communities and their leaders the data and the knowledge to reimagine cities as places of economic, environmental, and racial justice and liberation. And we do this by trying to center the story on diverse, marginalized voices that aren't normally heard, and by uplifting, a diverse set of authors and sources in our journalism. So we are a nonprofit. Most of our funding comes from grants and advertising and donations, but we do operate on a pay what you wish model, because part of our commitment to equity is that we don't want there to be any barriers to providing information to our audience. So we ask people who have the means to donate to us to attend our events or to watch our webinars and buy our ebooks. But for others who can't, there's no barrier to consuming our journalism. So next slide. So in terms of the size of our audience, this is just a quick look at our at the scope of what we do. We get about 2 million unique views every year. We have a newsletter base of 50,000 subscribers, and we have over 150,000 followers across Facebook and Twitter. But what's unique about Next City and what allows us to focus exclusively on solutions journalism is the kind of character of our audience. So we have audiences, we have audience members who are like Rachel, who have been with Next City for many years. And I can't tell you many people who say, I've read Next City since it was a print magazine, so, but these are the people who are actually doing the work in cities to make things better. Our reader surveys have shown that 74% say that they use Next City for their jobs, and that 89% of our readers say that they or their organizations are working towards greater racial equity. So these are the people who are actually involved in making change in cities. And then the next slide, I was going to hop to quickly and just say, this is where we have people working. So our readers are in city and urban planning, architecture, community organizing, housing and development, arts and culture. We really do have a dedicated membership base. So we're speaking to the people who know, who are looking for ideas and who know how to make things happen in their communities. And so that gives us the ability to really zoom in and focus on solutions exclusively. I know for a lot of news outlets, it's not possible, because you're, as a general interest news outlet, you're reporting on things like, flooding and weather events and breaking news and cities, experiencing violence. But at the same time, if you have dedicated sections of your outlet that are devoted to solution journalism, I think you can still, take some of these lessons, and I hope that you find some of what we talk about today helpful. So to just quickly, I think the next slide is about what topics we cover. So these are the broad strokes of the topics that we cover. And there's a lot of stuff underneath those topics that we go back to time and again. As you can see from these just sample stories that I put up there, we center equity in our reporting. So, to our mind, nothing that we do matters if it doesn't lead to making cities better and more equitable for everybody. And so that's really the kind of first place we start in any story that we cover is, what is this doing to make things better for everybody? So, so that's just a quick overview of what we do and who we reach and how we approach our journalism. And, then I think we can just go on with the conversation.
Absolutely. So feel free to drop questions at any point during the chat, and I will ask those questions of Kelly and Rachel. But let's start with kind of the process. Rachel, you work directly with writers. What does it look like start to finish on doing solution stories on a regular basis at Next City?
Yeah, as I was thinking about this and preparing for this, I thought a lot about, for example, how we structure our pitch page where we say, how to pitch us and what we're looking for. And I feel like, and I'm noticing, by the way, that most of the people who introduce themselves in chat are editors, but I know there's also some reporters in here as well. But I think that, our how to pitch us page is not that much different than sort of a standard or more traditional newsrooms how to pitch us page, because I think a good solutions pitch is not that much different from a regular pitch. I still want to know what the story is, why is it important to cover now, how you'll approach covering that story, and with some details. I want to look into whether such and such and such a thing is not a good pitch, regardless of whether you're taking a solutions angle or not. It's especially important to have sort of the details in hand with solutions journalism, but it's important for any kind of pitch. We do get a lot of pitches from people who don't seem to have been working with the solutions journalism mindset. It does seem kind of like a one-time like mental hump to get over if you are not sort of used to thinking in that way. But I absolutely have been willing to work with people to get it right. It oftentimes ends up being sort of multiple back and forth conversations. Or, a lot of times, I'll get sort of a more straightforward pitch and I'll say, this topic is really important to us. The topic is, flooding in cities, or
affordable housing.
Yeah, the topic is there isn't any affordable housing, or there's surveillance, that governments are using. And the challenge there is, this is a very important topic. Who's doing this work to from a solutions angle? And most of the time the writer can think of someone, and then it's just up to them to then go back and see if whoever this group is that's addressing this problem has any evidence backing up their solution. So I feel like, even when you get a pitch that comes in that's not solutions journalism at all, there is oftentimes, if you're patient enough to go back and forth, there's oftentimes a way to get a solution story out of it. Just like with any pitch process, again, this is, I don't think, that much different from the traditional journalism. You do have to sort of continue to push for details. All right, this program gives job training to people who have barriers to employment. Okay, great, but how many people have they helped, right? And I think actually, in SJN's training, which is fantastic, and if you haven't been through it, you should. You guys talk a lot about the need for evidence,
right, data.
But I almost think that the harder part to get right of a solutions journalism pitch, and maybe even the more important one, is what SJN has been calling insight, but what I usually call so what. So to go back to this job training example, there are lots of programs all over the country that do job training for people with barriers to employment. But so what? How is this one different? And I think a lot of people who are sort of general assignment reporters think that they can just be like, okay, well, this is good, I'm going to write about this. But as SJN has emphasized very strongly in the past, correctly, it's not just about, is this good? It's, is this program run differently from other ones, and that's why it works better? Does it have a success rate that is so much better than all these other programs nationwide? Or, if you're a local outlet, is this program the only game in town where your paper is based? That could be a good so what for you. It's not for Next City since we're a national outlet, but you do need to figure out what the so what is. And I think that's almost harder to do than to find evidence of whether the response is working.
Yeah, and I would say that, Rachel, that just to kind of tie it back to Next City's mission is that, Next City is reporting on small scale solutions that exist in one city, so that with the idea that we're inspiring people to take that idea from one city to the next city. Did you get that? And so I think that scalability is also a really important point in talking about a solution. If it's working on a small scale here, is it something that could work elsewhere? Or maybe it's not, maybe it's not, and then you can also talk about why. But yeah, I think that there's that idea of, if something is working in one scenario, are there elements of it that could work elsewhere?
Rachel, do you get a lot of pitches or starting points of like that the response is a recently approved ordinance or you know, a program that's just getting started and it's lacking, you know, you need that evidence, you need to guide reporters towards like, this has to be something that's actually happening on the ground. I know that I see a lot of that of trying to help reporters find those examples on the ground. What does that look like for you as you're working with writers?
Yes, that. So since we are a national outlet, we do have the luxury of usually these ordinances that, you know, recently passed, they're almost never invented in a vacuum, right? So someone somewhere has tried something similar. And so sometimes the recently passed ordinance in city X is the news hook. And then you say, but it was also tried in this smaller city Y, and here's how it worked. And this is why we think it will work in bigger city X. Or, you know, we actually just have a story coming out soon that is, actually, no, sorry, it already ran. It ran today or yesterday. What is time? I don't know. But the idea, so it was about Austin, Texas has
Yeah.
the new right to return policy, which is supposed to mean that if new housing is built in a neighborhood where people have been historically gentrified and priced out of it, they should be able to like prove that they have historic ties to the neighborhood and get preference to come back into those new housing units. This is the first project in Austin where this rule is being affected, but they learned from what happened in Portland. So we used Portland, Oregon's response, which has not been so great. They have not successfully like returned quite as many people as they hoped, but we were able to sort of cite that evidence to be like, now this is how we expect things to possibly play out on the ground in Austin, although it is untested. So that happens a lot. And then the other things happen when something is really brand new. I really just snooze the email for 6 months. You know, I'll tell them, like, this is just too new, please follow up in 6 months. And a lot of times they do, and they say, you know, there's a great example of this with the story we ran earlier this year, I think, about Desegregate Connecticut, which at the time when the writer originally pitched it, the group had just formed and they had made this incredible map that they had to like go through every single paper zoning record in the entire state. And they made a map of like where you can build housing in Connecticut. And it was this great map because you could look at it and you can see, wow, there's, you know, 5% of the land is you're allowed to build apartments on it, and everywhere else is zoned for sprawl. And like that's bad for it's bad for climate, it's bad for people who want to be able to afford houses who haven't already purchased a house, they're being priced out. It's bad for a lot of reasons. And so they had just made this map and I was like, I don't know, it seems kind of soon. And then like 3 or 4 months later, because of this map, they had a bill introduced in the Connecticut state legislature, which was then passed. And, you know, basically this map led to very amazing zoning reform in the state. And so then we were able to go back and say, here's how they did it. And this is the impact that it had.
To the example of Austin and like seeing how a strategy, maybe a response didn't work as well in some other place. I think that's such a great opportunity for accountability though, of holding local officials accountable to say, are you working to resolve the challenges or the problems when this was implemented somewhere else? Do you see that in people's reporting?
That is absolutely something that we try to do. I think we could probably do more of it, but yeah, that is absolutely a valid strategy.
Yeah, I think I just recently did a 2-part story with Steve Volk, who's a writer for Resolve Philly, which is the journalism collaborative that we are a part of because we are members of, we're based in Philadelphia. And Steve has done a year-long reporting project on foster care, on the issues in foster care and looking at issues in foster care through a solutions lens. And he did an amazing 2-part story about how to eliminate or how to address racial bias in foster care, because the statistics are very clear and very overwhelming that non-white children get removed from homes at disproportionately higher rates than white children do. And non-white families are investigated at disproportionately higher rates for issues that are often attributed to economic hardship, whether it's substandard housing or, healthy food access and things like that. But they're put into the system at disproportionately higher rates and then find it hard to get out of the system. And so one of the things that he was talking about is there are some solutions that are out there. One of them being something called blind removal meetings, where you actually mask all of the kind of racially identifying factors in the cases as they're being reviewed. And it showed initially a significant drop it was astonishing, a significant drop in the number of non-white families and kids that entered into the system, right? But there was this weird kind of backlash to it where the agencies that were part of this experiment felt like they were being called racist. And so they were really resistant to kind of implementing this on a large scale for this very reason, which seems so, inconceivable in a way. But you see that, he was talking to people and saying, but why can't this be implemented? Why can't you do this? And so to see a solution that's working, but that's still finding resistance to the implementation, that's also a point of exploration in a story.
Mm-hmm. We have a question I'd like to bring in here on another, specific topic that you cover frequently. What's an effective way to report on the homeless epidemic? Is the reporter allowed to suggest a solution within the story?
Kelly, I can take this one if you want.
Sure.
Maybe this is old school of me. I don't feel like reporters should be in the business of suggesting much at all. But what we can do is point to what's working. Next City has been doing sort of a mini series on the Built for Zero initiative, which is run out of a nonprofit called Community Solutions. It just got something like $1 million from the MacArthur Foundation, I think. And they have, a great series of interventions in multiple cities across the country that they're literally trying to end homelessness. And you can sort of quibble about what the definition of end homelessness means, but they really are having results. And so we've been reporting on how this plays out on the ground in basically every single city that they've been working with. The series is on hiatus right now, but we hope to pick it back up very soon. I don't think that we should be suggesting things, but I think we should be finding what works. I think this is the core of solutions journalism, is finding what works and presenting it. And maybe you suggest it to your politician and say, why aren't we trying this, and see what they say. But yeah, that's what we do.
And I would also say that if you look at the stories that we've done about this, about addressing homelessness, ending homelessness, the Built for Zero movement, I feel like there's a high level thread that's carried through all of them, which is meeting people where they are and having personal attention to the people that are being affected, right? So it feels to very much like getting people placed in transitional housing, getting people what they need, even building relationships of trust with the outreach, with the people who are doing the outreach and the people who need housing. There's different ways of doing that depending on whether someone is a veteran or a family with small children or somebody who's experiencing addiction, but it feels like that's the thread that's carried through, like make the connection, find out what they need, connect them to the services. And that's a solutions element that we see carried throughout a lot of stuff related to eviction diversion, I'm trying to think of some other returning citizens, issues related to employment and housing for returning citizens, find out what people need and help them get to the place that's going, get to the people and the offices and the programs that are going to help them.
Mhm.
Yeah, I
It's
just
such
say-
Go ahead, Rachel.
I'm very impressed at how quickly you are putting things in the chat. So thank you for managing our chat so well.
It's like I do this every day.
Oh my God.
I had, it's such a huge topic, especially on, homelessness. I talk so often with journalists about how, as a program, Kelly, you mentioned a lot of different strategies, which are small responses within a very large problem in communities across the country. How do you help writers kind of break down and feel good about a solution story? Like, it's not the solution. If, let's say, the program that's working with veterans, it's not going to solve everything with homelessness, but how do you kind of think about and talk with your reporters you're working with about the value of that in the scope of your work overall on that particular topic?
I think that part of it is, that's one of the tips that I had kind of put into this presentation, is like, don't oversell the solution, right? This is not going to, this is not going to solve, the big issue, right? And to Rachel's point that she just made, maybe that's not your job, right? You're showing and you're not telling, right? You're showing that this is a program in your, the area that you cover, that is showing results. And then what you're doing is you're leading people to the information, and then what they do with it is another thing, right? So nothing really, I feel like change is incremental, right? Much of change that we see is incremental. One of the things that I talk about a lot is the change that I've seen just in when I started working at Next City, and how we talk about what used to be called universal basic income and now is called guaranteed income. So when Michael Tubbs, who was the he founded Mayors for Guaranteed Income, the former mayor of Stockton, started this program in Stockton, people were like, that's crazy, like socialist talk or whatever. He got a lot of blowback about that. And then as the year went on, and like as the data started coming in, it was like, yeah, actually it wasn't a lot of money, but it made a difference in people's lives, and then cities started signing on to that, and there was, like, it just gained some momentum. And what started out as an idea that seemed very much on the outskirts of urban policy became something. I mean, if you look at their website and the number of cities that are participating in some fashion, it's inspiring to see the number of cities that have signed on to this. And he's always said that this is a program that starts local, that they're showing the federal government how it should be done. Like, they've always thought that this was something that should be institutionalized. And so again, you're starting small, you're showing what's happening. I think the fact that the data backed up the fact that people didn't stop working and like freeload, they were using it to pay emergency bills and to help keep them going. And especially during the pandemic, this became, a much more accepted idea. So I think you don't oversell it. This isn't the solution. This might not be the solution to all of homelessness, but it is making a difference in your community in this way. And then you offer that up to people, and then they do with it what they will.
I'm going to make a plug real quick here. If folks are not familiar, when I mentioned earlier, prolific publisher of solutions journalism, Next City has more than 300 stories in our solution story tracker, which are vetted stories on a range of different topics. And so if you're a reporter covering something like homelessness or covering universal basic income, and you want to see how others have reported on it, see where your reporting fits in, broader coverage of that issue, you can search by keywords in the tracker. I just put a link in the chat.
We're number 3.
We have another question from the chat. Do you have solutions beats, or does every reporter contribute to solution stories?
Everybody does, right, Rachel?
Well, I think the thing that Kelly did not go over in her wonderful About Us presentation is that Next City is a staff of 8.
Yes.
9. No, we're 8 because we don't have our
We're
intern.
8.
Yeah, so we are 8. you are looking at pretty much the entire editorial department. We have one full-time reporter who does have a beat. His name is Oscar, and he is our senior economics correspondent. But everyone else is freelance. And I would imagine that most of our freelancers don't really have beats. I mean, certainly I know their strengths and like what kinds of things they want to write about, but they all write about whatever as long as it's solutions focused.
Yeah, and I think that we have some writers that we've worked with for a long enough time that we feel like, you know, we trust their solutions mojo and believe that, like, you know, they know the drill and they know how to approach a certain story. You know, one thing that came out, we had a reporters roundtable at the end of last year when we were talking about our solutions of the year. And one of our reporters, Emily Nonko, who's an extremely prolific solutions journalism contributor, and you'll find many of her stories in the tracker. She said, you know, people don't realize that it's pretty labor intensive to do solutions reporting, because you're constantly, to Rachel's point from earlier, pulling on threads that started, you know, months ago to see how things are coming along. Like you're bookmarking, you know, certain stories that seem interesting, but you have to wait and see how they unfold. You're digging into data, it's not a sort of, you know, see a news brief, bang out a story and move on. Like it's very much like digging into the particulars, like what are the obstacles, what have been the challenges, are they being overcome, does the data back it up? And so it's labor intensive. And I think that's something that it's hard to do consistently because of the time investment that's involved. But luckily we've, you know, hit upon freelancers who are able to do that and who have cultivated enough contacts. Like Oscar, our senior economics correspondent, has been writing solution stories for probably, I don't know, 5 or 6 years now. And I think he constantly has, like, he'll do one story and he'll put a pin in one piece of that story and be like, oh, that's another story, and I'm going to follow up on that later on, you know, like that kind of thing. So once you get on the wagon, like, and it's moving along, like you can kind of see how the stories will follow on themselves, but it is more labor intensive.
What about when we often say that not every story is a solution story? You know, you still got to do your reporting on it, and sometimes the response isn't what you expected when you started. What happens then?
What do you do? Rachel?
I mean, I do have to kill stories occasionally, which is really unfortunate because, again, we work with a lot of freelancers and we don't necessarily have like a very kill fee baked into the contract. So it's something that I really try not to do. You know, I always want to try to work with folks as much as possible to try to salvage the story. So that's the short but true answer. Is it is really unpleasant all around to give up on something, but sometimes you do have to.
And I would also say that sometimes, you know, although it's not a traditional solution story, but pivoting a story from like, hey, this is a great solution, to, hey, this is a solution that really has gone wrong, and why did it go wrong, is also really instructive. You know, because our readership, again, has this, you know, kind of interest in reading and discussing and kind of being inspired by urban issues, finding out when something went wrong and what happened and trying to figure that out can help sort of push it forward into a new iteration, right? So, you know, I'm trying to think of some examples right now of like a solution gone wrong story that we've done. And nothing's really coming to mind right now, but I know that has happened. And part of that is the editing and the assigning process, right? Because, we kind of, Rachel went into this a little bit, but I will, say that the most important part of this is figuring out the approach that you want to take going into the story, and then checking in with the reporter during the story in case there are any issues that are coming up. So if a reporter is finding out that their assumptions were not what they thought they would be, or there's some new bit of data, or sometimes there's no there, as we say, like the solution was just a very craftily written PR pitch or something, something like that, then you check in and you say, okay, that's a gut check point. And you're like, okay, where do we go from here? And is there a way to pivot it to something like that? It didn't work. And why didn't it work? Or it hasn't had the results, and why hasn't it had the results that was expected of it? But sometimes, as Rachel said, like it's more of a singular kind of like, oh, here's a great program about, a way to, get people IDs. Oh, but guess what? Like they only got 4 people their IDs. And, then, okay, then that is not something we're going to be writing about, So, so I think that sometimes a solution's gone wrong story is still a really valuable story to write.
Mm-hmm. Any other, details about what distinguishes a solution story from a non-solution story? It's a question from our chat.
Do you want to answer that one, Sarah?
Well, you guys answer it first.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think everything I've learned from SJN. So, a solution story is focused on the response, not the problem. There's evidence, and there's, like I said, there's insight or so what or whatever you want to call it, but there's some reason to explain why you chose this particular response to write about and not some other response.
Yeah.
And I will add the fourth pillar is limitations. Yes. Limitations of their response. Rachel, you're a little quiet now. Maybe you've leaned back a little further.
I probably have. I apologize.
Yeah. Fourth pillar is we always want those limitations because we are journalists, not PR professionals selling a particular response. We're providing our audience with the details about how the response works. Let's transition here. We've got a great question that'll take us into how you engage with your audience. How have you built an excited audience around these stories? This journalist says, I've done some killer solutions journalism stories, especially on urban issues that just don't get much traffic. How do we train our audience to be more interested in those stories?
Oh, that's a great question. I think for us, it's a little bit easier because we have, as I said, like a captive audience who are really interested in this work. So they're very curious about, reading about housing and reading about economic development and about, we have a lot of people interested in transportation. That's why we put that question in the chat, because we have a lot of transit nerds in our audience, so, but I think that this speaks to this kind of broader question of how people are engaged with the world around them, right? So do they want to read about a community, community engagement process? Like, how do they get involved in going to zoning meetings? And do they understand that, attending a zoning meeting affects, how their neighborhood is going to look, in the next 10 years, being able to hear about that and the changes that are being made and kind of making those connections to what it means to the people that are affected. And so I think part of the way that we do the solutions journalism is to try and ground it in the people that are involved in the stories. So to humanize, so it's not just a story about a policy, right? It's a story about here is a person who is starting a business in their neighborhood, but they don't have access to capital because they don't have a high credit score. They, had trouble being unbanked early in their, adulthood. And then what happens? Like they really have this great idea for a food, a catering company or a food truck or a bookstore. What do? And so then this is a program that is speaking, a program such as the Runway Project in San Francisco, which provides, it's called Friends and Family Money, like access to capital for entrepreneurs of color who might not have family members that can bankroll them, to get a business off the ground. So, that you're grounding it in the story of a person with a business, and sort of watching how that is making a difference in their life, and so I think that's one way to make it really relevant to people, is just human interest, right? Everybody wants to read a story about someone who's trying to overcome an obstacle, right? So that is one way that we do that. Another way, which we can talk about, in a bit, is that we do kind of wraparound content in addition to the stories that we write. So we try to, deliver these solutions via online journalism. We create ebooks that are thematic. So, Rachel's done some great ebooks about public libraries, about libraries turning into, social service hubs and all of the different things that they're able to do now, including a great story that we ran during the height of COVID about San Francisco librarians being trained as contact tracers because their attention to detail and their knowledge of research, really made that such a great fit, and it kept them employed while the libraries were closed. So that's that's one way to to do the journalism and then to do the thematic ebooks, but then we also do webinars, and the webinars are typically focused on a particular solution that digs into it a little bit deeper with the people who were involved in creating the solution, and it's a little bit more practitioner focused. So you're kind of talking about, okay, what were the steps that you went through to try and do this, and what obstacles did you face, and what were your lessons learned, and how would you iterate through the obstacles for V2 of what you're trying to do. So it's kind of creating this wraparound content around particular solutions as well.
Yeah, I have some more questions about kind of your webinars and things like that in a moment, but I want to stay with this and actually ask about, I get a lot of questions from journalists about headlines and visuals, and I think that you guys do a really good job in general of writing headlines that signal to people that there's something in the story of people overcoming that challenge, like you were saying, Kelly. And then to me, a lot of the visuals do include people, and especially up at the top of stories. Rachel, how do you think about that with the writers you're working with? How do you approach headlines and visuals that this would be relevant to any news outlet of making their stories really compelling and engaging with their potential audience?
That's really nice to hear. I struggle with visuals a lot. In fact, we have a very, very limited photo and budget, so we often have to make do with what we can. Again, I think this is the same with any news outlet that's strapped for cash, which is all of us. A lot of it is setting expectations up front with the writers, because I want to say at least half the time, we are running photos that have been provided by the people who are in the story. If you set expectations up front with the writer, that you say, when you talk to this person, please ask her if she has any pictures from the thing that she did. And also those pictures need to be in this horizontal orientation. They need to be at least 1,000 pixels wide, and we need to have a person in them. If you set that expectation up front, you are more likely, but not guaranteed, to get back what you want. And so we do rely a lot on wire photos, and we also rely a lot on Creative Commons images and sort of more stock type things, which is not my favorite thing in the world. And if there's a photojournalist in the chat, I'm sorry, but it's sort of the reality of being a 8-person nonprofit newsroom.
And what about headlines? How do you think about writing headlines to go with these solution stories?
Headlines are also really hard. Kelly, do you have any insight?
I mean, I really just try, I mean, just keeping SEO in mind as well. Like, you try to have the keywords in there. A lot of times we do a lot of question headlines, which I notice as I start to look at like our list of stories in our content management system, what, how, when, like just kind of seeing those question words. But it is a way to bring a reader in and say like, oh, here's a question and the story purports to answer it, so I think that I tend to err on like writing very long headlines, which I know are not optimal, because when people are sharing them, they might not it might not fully render. So I don't know. I think that it's kind of keeping keywords in mind to give people a sense of the story at the beginning, and then finding a way to tease them into the story and not to give away the whole story in the headline, right? Because then people are like, oh, that's interesting. They just passed this bill, moving on, like they read the headline and then they just like keep going, so.
Yeah, and this isn't specific to solutions journalism, but I think that I've seen this come up in more solutions focused newsrooms, and again in discussions with SJN folks. But as the industry moves towards terms like people experiencing homelessness instead of homeless people, as the industry moves towards those kinds of terms, our headlines are sort of getting longer and longer, because we want to tell the story but be respectful. And I don't think that's a challenge that anyone's completely solved yet. So, that's also a thing that's on our radar. And I've said this in other webinars, but if anyone has ideas, please let me know.
Yeah, for sure.
I think this is something the entire industry is grappling with, but I see it more in solutions focused reporting.
Absolutely. You do have webinars throughout the year. These are tied to stories and feature the people doing the work in communities, and as a way of sharing what they've learned, of connecting with others who are doing that work. What's made your webinars successful, Rachel?
I'm going to actually let Kelly take this one, because I'm not so involved with the webinar program.
Sure. Yeah, I'll take that one. Yeah, I think that, again, as I was mentioning, alluded to earlier, I think it's that they're very practitioner focused, that they're very practical in terms of, how I just moderated a webinar last week about a program called Tennessee Reconnect, which is a program. It's a public-private partnership with community colleges and with an organization, the state, which is helping to place adult learners in community colleges and set them up for success so that they actually complete their degree. And so this is a really interesting idea, right? Because it helps to narrow the wage gap for people, especially for women of color who are heads of household, to give them the tools to get an education, have it paid for, and then get a higher paying job. So with the two people, one from Tennessee Reconnect, the group, and one from Tennessee State University, or Nashville State University, sorry. I was able to, just dig in, like, how did you get started? Like, what were the obstacles? And again, with a common theme, it was finding out what people needed. Sometimes they needed help navigating the financial aid form. Sometimes they needed childcare so that they had time to attend classes. Sometimes they were food insecure. And so they realized that having a space to gather where they offered food and actually not just snacks, but they started a food pantry, was like really helpful in kind of keeping people in the program and keeping people learning and keeping people enrolled, semester after semester. And so we really kind of dig into that kind of stuff. And then, how would you set it up in another place? If you were doing this, if you could do this over again, how would you do it better or differently? Or what are things that people need to look out for if they're trying to set it up? And so it's that kind of it's that kind of like very nitty gritty like focus that seems to get people engaged, because it's inspiring them to think about how this idea could work in their own city. So the webinars happen in real time, but then we have recordings on our site that people can go and watch them once they're done.
And I know a lot of people are probably very curious about how you've generated revenue to support this work, Kelly. This is a really important part of newsrooms and sustainability. So have you diversified your revenue as a nonprofit to support this kind of solutions focused reporting?
Yeah, it's really great. I think that, as with many nonprofit news organizations, the majority of our funding comes from grants. And so, including from Solutions Journalism Network. And, that is a reality of our business. And so, we feel like by continuing to practice this work that centers equity and center solutions, that we're able to, make those connections with funders to cover these issues that are important, for people to be learning about. At the same time, when I started working at Next City, the webinars were really just an idea, in like a glimmer in the eye of our events director. And she really, 6 months into my job here, she was like, well, let's just try it and see what happens, and she really just made this happen. Our development director and our events director worked together and just thought like, well, let's do 3 and let's see how they do. And those 3 webinars raised like several $1,000s. Again, with a pay what you wish model. And so it just became a very inspiring and kind of self-sustaining program where, we get together editorially and we figure out what are the best ideas that would engage people. And we know what topics our readers are interested in. And so we try and speak to that. Sometimes it's an author of a book that we want to have a conversation with. Sometimes it's, again, a practitioner. Sometimes it's a roundtable with multiple people having conversations. We did some flash webinars last year during COVID that were extremely successful, where Oscar, our economics correspondent, was talking about the PPP program and how to help people navigate the application process. Our housing correspondent at the time did one about the eviction moratoria and how to get help with rent. So it's really just trying to be responsive to the interests of your readers. And again, with the pay what you wish, we feel like people have responded really well to that. That's a revenue stream that did not exist when I started working here. And it's grown into, a good chunk of our revenue. So, so part of it is also devoting staff to the work, right? So now, our audience engagement editor, that's part of her responsibility, is to do webinars. We now have a dedicated person who does advertising sales. So, and that's not revenue that, again, we had when I started working here. And so now we can go to people for sponsored content and for selling ads and for, sponsoring our events and for buying ads in our end of year print magazines. And so all of that, getting the people with an 8-person staff, everybody does they wear a lot of hats, but like having people to focus on these particular jobs that do bring in revenue has been really impactful.
Question from the chat. How do you know what your readers are interested in? Do you survey them?
Yes, we do. We do. We did a big reader survey at the end of 2019. That was a lot of the percentages that you saw in the presentation. We have a lot of engagement with our readers in terms of like asking them for like what newsletters they're interested in finding out about. asking for feedback in the webinar, like following up with our webinars to ask for feedback. So we are periodically checking in with our readers, and then typically every year we do a big reader survey. I think we did not do one last year, Rachel. I'm not sure because of COVID.
Sounds right.
But yeah, but I can't be sure.
We have time if we're almost to the end of the hour here, but if folks have more questions, we could get to one or two more questions if you put them in the chat really quickly. I'm going to pull up your slides again, Kelly. These are kind of, review kind of our best tips to leave people with today.
Yeah. So when I said start from the start, I mean, define in your vertical or your mission statement, what it is that you're looking for, why is the reason that you're here and the work that you're doing. And then again, to carry it through the pitch guidelines. And as I said, keep in touch with the writer throughout the process so that you don't have any surprises at the end. So outline and through line feedback. And then I've also found that when somebody's writing a story, I send them examples of stories that I really like and that I thought worked really well, even from an organizational standpoint, like, oh, here's an interesting way you could maybe organize the story, like take this approach, or here's how we've covered this issue in the past. So kind of taking that through the process from soup to nuts. And then the pitfalls, be realistic about the time investment, again, because as we said, solutions journalism does seem to take, it's a bit more intensive than just kind of traditional or, the usual deadline newspaper reporting. Don't oversell the solution, as we talked about. Don't force the solution, that sometimes there's not enough there to warrant the story, and don't shortchange the related content. That's something that Rachel brought up in a conversation we had the other day, which is the webinars and the ebooks, they can't really be an afterthought because we found that shows it shows in the doing of it. We really need to have as mindful an approach to our related content as we do to the journalism content that we're producing in order to kind of round it out.
Yeah, build engagement and continuing the work.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much. I feel like we covered a lot of ground in an hour. We don't have any more questions right now, so I will save this recording and share it out. So thankful to everyone who joined us today for this conversation. Let me know. I'm going to put my email again in the chat. I'm Sarah Gustavus Lim. If you have any questions or other things that you want answered from the folks at Next City, they generously shared their contact information here with us. Thank you, Kelly and Rachel, so much. Great to work with you. And thank you for sharing some insights into your process at Next City.
All right. Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody.